speaking for the Navajo Nation, they were just aired on World News Tonight with David Muir last night. And that was an excellent episode. Very sad for me because those are my people, my brothers and sisters. And I think as Native Americans, we're all related. You know, we're all considered brothers and sisters. So it hurts. And we have now surpassed New York State in the positive COVID cases. The Navajo Nation as a whole compares to the state of West Virginia. So there's a lot of remote areas that don't have electricity or running water, and this has been ongoing for years. It would cost millions to help these people get running water, and some have to travel 10 to 50 miles just to get water for their homes, and they have dirt floors. And this is the life that they know. This is a life that they've grown up in, and some prefer that life. So, you know, our aunts, we were put there by the government, and you have to make do to survive without modern conveniences. And today, this virus has really been hard, I think, because of the high rate of diabetes, and I think high blood pressure has really affected our people, my people.
More about the Navajo. They have an infection rate that is greater than New York and New Jersey. Although listening to the chief, you know, he would respond as well that the Navajo also have tested a greater number or a greater percentage of their own people. It's something of 17% of their population that they've been able to test, whereas New York and others have tested maybe 7%. And so one response might be that, you know, the numbers are high, but also if they were to test 17% of New York and other places, they might show even higher infection rates. And I think part of what the chief was responding to was that the Navajo are worse off than other places. And they certainly do experience a number of struggles that are distinct to them. And even regarding the water, that 30% of Navajo don't have reliable sources of clean water, that 40% of homes don't have running water in their houses. Much of that, even if they could have running water, right? They could set up wells and such locally to them. There's such distress amongst or around the present water supply that they have because of local uranium mining. There's a large concern that the water itself is tainted with uranium. And so this is why they have to go 15 to 50 miles away to a clean water source to gather water. So a lot of this is flaring up and showing us some of the systematic problems that they have that you know, as a state, as corporations that benefit from, you know, from the water supplies, from the minerals, from the uranium there, right? That we all collectively play a role in this.
Yeah, I think that this kind of demonstrates the context in which the Navajo were hit by COVID-19. It's something that, you know, everyone around the world is facing, but not with the same circumstances that the Navajo have to face them. You know, they have disproportionately higher rates of diabetes and obesity and a number of factors that put you at high risk. You know, and a number of people working jobs that where you can't necessarily distance yourself from others, and so it has put them at an extremely high risk. And so if you look at the rates in their area, you know, their mortality rate is disproportionately higher than other ethnic groups. I read one study that said that in Arizona, the mortality rate among the Navajo is 5 times more than any other ethnic group. In New Mexico, the rate is 7 times higher. And in New Mexico, deaths among the indigenous is more than half of the deaths from COVID-19 in the entire state. And nationally, it's hard to know what the numbers are for other tribes because most states count indigenous people as other. They don't really keep track of indigenous health. And so it varies from tribe to tribe. You know, the Navajo are probably the worst hit, but there are also other tribes that are managing really well. And so I think, you know, kind of to lean on something Chris was mentioning is, you know, at the one hand, you want to see clearly the challenges and the suffering that that Native folks are facing at this time, and not shy away from that. But on the other hand, you don't want to put them into a box of, you know, just being victims, like helpless victims that can't handle it in as sophisticated a way as other people. You know, there is, while there is a lot of hurt in Native communities right now, there's also a lot of resilience. And there's a lot of strength being shown. I look to, you know, the Tsalagi, my people. They've been able to keep control of the situation pretty well. You know, they set up some pretty extreme measures. They set up roadblocks fairly early on and checkpoints, not allowing people into their territory. They have a much smaller territory than the Navajo, so it was feasible for them to do it. There aren't a lot of places to get in. And so they, as of now, they are one of the few places in the United States that is doing complete contact tracing. They know all of the people who have coronavirus in their territory, and they are forcing them to quarantine, and they're taking extra measures as a community to make sure that they have what they need so that they're not going out and infecting other people. And so there are cases of great strength happening among other tribes as well.
The nature of the CARE Act funds that have been going to Native American tribes. So $8 billion in the CARE Act was set aside to help tribes. One story that's been going around is that this money has been held up. And, you know, if you read a short piece, so oftentimes it'll say, well, it's being held up because some of that money is going to for-profit companies. And when that was discovered, all the money got held up and litigation resulted. And what seems to be the case is that our, you know, Alaskan brothers and sisters have been incorporated into for-profit corporations in Alaska that manage the land. And so if there's a place to give money to, it seems to be to give money to these corporations that are for-profit that I presume benefit from the utilization of the land. But it's largely Alaskan Native Americans have stock in these companies. So I don't know all the exact politics that go around that, but it seemed to be that the other Federated Native American tribes in the lower states here were concerned that money would be going to these incorporated tribes up in Alaska when they have other revenues for funds that they should be able to levy. So money got held up with that, and the concern was that as they litigate this, the United States government shouldn't just be holding on to the money. They need to distribute that as soon as possible. And so that's why the Cherokee and the Navajo and others have litigated against the United States government. And as of now, I think they've received something about 40% of the initial $8 billion that have been reserved for tribes. But that money is still being litigated and how it's going to be distributed. And hopefully as soon as possible that the full funds will get distributed to Native American tribes. So unfortunately, the government's response or ability to get money to tribes has not has been as speedy as other means of getting money. And then that just speaks to kind of the long history of complicated relationships of tribal sovereignty and working with Native American governments. Bobby, would you want to talk about what's happening with the tribe of Massachusetts?
Yeah, no, I mean, and so this is, I mean, so just kind of thinking in the broader context of, you know, I think the legacy of dealing with treaties with the United States government, and I think that there's a lot of hurt and sensitivity among activists now thinking about parallels between, you know, facing a pandemic now and historical circumstances in the past when we faced pandemics, and how those have been opportunities for colonization. That was something that I found particularly, I don't know, kind of hurtful, but I think just kind of frustrating early on when everyone was talking about how unprecedented this pandemic is. And sure, this is a terrible disease. This is a terrible virus. This is a global crisis. But, you know, pandemics are not unprecedented by any stretch of the imagination, not even in this nation. Smallpox outbreak decimated native populations, and settlers took advantage of that to steal land. And one of the tribes that was on the forefront of that happening early on was the Wampanoag, in the territory around the state of Massachusetts now. So the tribe that was part of the first Thanksgiving meal, the Wampanoag, well, a section of their descendants, the Mashpee Wampanoag, right at the very beginning of the lockdown for the coronavirus, the federal government decided to revoke their reservation status, their tribal status, and to revoke their land held in federal trust. And now the Wampanoag have much more complicated resources at their disposal to resist that action of the government, and so it's being litigated, and hopefully they'll be able to continue to fight that. And,
what was the rationale for that?
The rationale, so this is a tribe that has not had a land, and they were not recognized federally in the I'm going to get the details. The details are fuzzy in my mind, but they weren't federally recognized as a tribe in the 1920s or whatever, when they first passed, you know, the Indian Land Act that put the criteria for which tribes got reservation land and status and lands held in trust in the federal government. Later on, they were federally recognized as a tribe. And so the argument from the federal government in recent years, within the last like 2-3 years, is that since they didn't have tribal status before this act was passed, that cancels the land that had been allotted to them in trust. So the federal government is kind of reneging on its agreement, which isn't news, to take away their land. And there are activists who are arguing that there are more nefarious reasons. You know, there are some private folks who are interested in building a casino on the land nearby because it's near Cape Cod, which is a tourist destination. And so there are some wealthy individuals who would profit from removing the Mashpee Wampanoag from their land so that they don't have competition with a casino there. But wow. You know, during, you know, in the midst of a lockdown and the coronavirus, while people's attention is focused on their own survival and what's going on with the pandemic, people don't have the bandwidth and the media outlets don't have the bandwidth to really pay much attention to some of these things that are happening. And again, I have to say that this also speaks, so it speaks on the one hand to this long story that's been unfolding for 500 years, in this land. But on the other hand, you see acts of resistance. I mean, you see Native people utilizing the U.S.'s own legal system to resist. And I mean, even when I mentioned before about the roadblocks, there are a couple of Sioux tribes in South Dakota that set up roadblocks to do checkpoints, and the governor there threatened to litigate them, to prosecute them for obstructing roadways that they didn't have a right to do. And again, it's a challenge of their sovereignty, their claim to be able to control who goes in and out and how travel happens on their land.
For me personally, it's sad, and it makes me angry, and if I want to say almost embarrassing, because my tribe is being put in the news for everybody to see, and poverty exists on a lot of the reservations, and it's just so unfortunate as indigenous people of this land that we are still trying, we are still striving to be recognized, and yet this pandemic has brought the poverty, the health of the Native people. And yet, like he said before, it also brings out the resilience and the coming together and people reaching out. And I need to focus more on that than the negative. My dad is 90 and I worry about him, but my siblings are taking good care of him and keeping him home. Nobody in my immediate family has been affected. And I think the majority of them are working from home. And here I am having to go to the University of Iowa Monday through Friday every day. And since this all started, and I haven't been tested once, but I keep up with what's going on with the tribe. I mean, I do follow some groups on Facebook is how I keep up. And of course, I call home once a week just to check on everybody. A lot of the Pueblo tribes around the area in New Mexico, he said they're smaller, so they blocked off. And my tribe, they have curfew from Friday night to Monday morning. And the border town had a lockdown for about a week. And they get their checks once a month, so a lot of the Native people will go into town to do their laundry, to do shopping, to buy feed and hay for their horses and cows. So it's a big deal for them to all go into town. And then when they had this lockdown, it really put everything on hold.
For one, living in Iowa, I wouldn't say that this has affected me any more than anyone else with respect to my Native identity, but it's but speaking to that, beyond just the general sadness and and just to underline everything Debbie had said, it's also through Facebook that I and been connected and seeing friends and friends of friends who are in New Mexico, who are in Arizona, connected to these tribes, and have seen resilience and hope. I am struck by the idea that it's not just natives that need our prayers, but just seeing these wonderful and beautiful videos that have been shared on my Facebook by friends who do ministry in the Native American communities of children in their regalia dancing their prayers for us, that we would be protected and that we would get through this as a community. And that just was, for me, such a beautiful recentering of where help and where hope is coming from. It's not just us praying for Native Americans. Native Americans are praying for us as a nation and praying that we all get through this, and that their prayer and their dance has power.
Mm.
That stands out to me. That still is a strong memory in my mind when someone asks, how's this affected you, or what are impressions or memories that stand out from this experience?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah. How about you, Bobby?
Yeah, I feel similar. I think I would have a different answer on different days, because I do have times when I feel overwhelmed with grief and anger, seeing vulnerable communities, whether it's Native communities or whether it is folks in poverty, whether it's folks in cities or in rural parts of the country of varying ethnicities. It just infuriates me to see how widespread this has become, and feeling like there's more we should be able to do to work collectively as a community and as governments, and to mitigate the impact of this, especially among the most vulnerable. I mean, it really gets me down. And I feel particularly disheartened when I see folks who aren't taking this seriously, who don't feel a responsibility to care for their community, or who've bought into conspiracy theories and stuff. But on the other hand, I try to focus on those who are accepting their freedom as a responsibility to care for the community, to care for the elders of the community, to care for those who are vulnerable. That's the opportunity in this moment that we all have as individuals and collectively, that we can demonstrate a path forward that is care for the most vulnerable, that is a sense of responsibility, not just to see whether I'm going to be okay, but to make sure that my next door neighbor is going to be okay, and to make sure my next door neighbor's parents and grandparents are going to be okay. And seeing that the majority of people really are on board with taking that responsibility seriously is life-giving, does provide a sense of hope. And it provides the sense of solidarity that I think we need with Native communities now and going forward. Because even when coronavirus passes, we are still going to have an epidemic of a lack of access to clean water, an epidemic of disproportionately high rates of diabetes, epidemic of poverty. Those are still epidemics that are going to continue in our society. And so I hope that the solidarity that we've been able to tap into ourselves, most of us have, and our sense of responsibility to community will continue going forward, that won't go away once there's a cure to this specific epidemic.
I would say prayer. And I know, speaking for a lot of Natives, that I'm careful to say that because a lot of them don't want that, just because of how Christianity was forced upon them years ago, generations ago, and that generational sin still exists. The trauma that happened to our people generations ago still exists. Even though I wasn't there, it's still there, in my blood, because it was my ancestors. So a lot of people I know, my friends, you got to be careful with reaching out in faith. They tend to lean more toward their native culture, what have you, their Mother Earth and Father Sky and the Great Spirit and Takashla and what have you. But monetary gifts, I'm sure, won't be turned down. And like Bobby said, Doctors Without Borders has gone to the Navajo Nation. Sean Penn, the actor, has gone and helped. They are being helped, and even the president of the Navajo Nation goes out and delivers boxes of food. So he's doing his part. And then people criticize him, and he's like, well, what are you doing? And that stops you right there, because really, what are you doing? So just being genuine in your care. And by being genuine, I mean being educated and really wanting to know about our culture.
The invitation, I think, as in all moments of tragedy and all moments of hardship that are always present within us or and around us, is to watch the news, to watch over our neighbors, to watch life with two eyes, right? To take in the suffering, but also to look for the hope, to look for the helpers, to hold both the tragedy of deaths that may be needlessly lost, and the anger that arises from questions of whether we could have done things differently, to taking in the beauty and the resilience and seeing children dancing in the regalia praying for us, by seeing people, nurses and doctors running to the front lines and going in day to day helping, and even when they get sick to come back and to help more. Prayer as always, but also to think about ways in which we can also give. So for the Navajo Nation, they just set up a GoFundMe page where you can directly give to the Navajo Nation, and they will distribute those funds to those in need. There is a community called, a nonprofit called I think it's called Dig Deep, and we can give links to this. But that is going into the Navajo Nation and digging up places for water to be stored, and then setting up houses with plumbing, as well as solar panels for energy. So to make these houses more energy and water independent. Right, so there's that labor of love we can give, and you know that we all have time, a little bit more time. It feels like we should have more time on our hands, but the way in which time just seems to just go so inefficiently these days, and so quickly at times. Take this or leave this, but this is always an opportunity to read, right? An opportunity to educate ourselves, so to take in different stories and to be watchful. There's many things that they're so accessible to take our attention away, right? All the clickbait that's out there to be enraged about, and yet there are so many stories that are on the margins that we miss. And so to try to make a discipline to find new stories, and this might be an invitation to learn more about the history of Native American struggles with pandemics, with treaty rights and concerns over sovereignty. And the more you know, the more these other stories that oftentimes go on the margins will stand out to you. And you share those stories with others, and through that we have grassroots movements of concern, and it educates your voting.
This has become an opportunity for us all to recognize that we are all vulnerable, that we are all weak, that the U.S. is the wealthiest nation on earth. It's got the largest military by far on earth. We've got so many resources at our disposal, and yet we are still this vulnerable, this fragile. That life in society is something very delicate. And so then when we recognize our own weakness and our own vulnerability, I think that can help us connect in developing a relationship of mutual solidarity with others who may be vulnerable or weak in particular ways, whether it is the Navajo Nation or whether it is rural Appalachian coal miners, whatever it may be, that we all are vulnerable, we all are weak, we are all mortal. and we all need each other, and that is apparently true to us now. It is very readily apparent to us now, but it's always true. But we live under this illusion that we got our act together most of the time, that we got our lives under control, but we don't. And so this is an opportunity for us to see that clearly.